I received a call a few hours ago from someone I've known for a long time, and a gentleman in his, I would say, early to mid-90s. And he wanted me to stop saying that what we're facing is an unprecedented challenge. And I was taken aback. I mean, none of us have ever lived through anything like this or confronted a situation this painful or so dramatic. And so he challenged me to do something that I'd actually done a few years ago, but as it shows, even a few years erodes memory about things that happened long in the past. He challenged me to say, everybody's comparing this to the last time we had something like this. It required the nation to react like we did in World War II. And so it caused me to go back and look a little bit at the years before that great and bloody conflict. It's interesting, in the years leading up to 1941, President Roosevelt had an effort to pack the Supreme Court. And it was incredibly controversial. It ended up falling apart in 1937. It ended up falling apart, actually, because members of his own party turned against him. And it actually weakened him in that tail end of his second deal. President Roosevelt was so upset about what members of his own party had done to him that in 1938, he did something unprecedented at the time. He got involved in Democratic primaries and tried to take out members of his own party who had opposed him. Not only did he lose badly in that effort, I think he only won one of those seats that he went after. As a result of what he did, his party lost 6 seats in the Senate, 71 in the House, and ultimately, in this very chamber, a Republican, Robert Taft, was able to put together a coalition with conservative Democrats and basically block President Roosevelt's agenda leading into 1940. Then in 1940, Roosevelt did something else that was unprecedented and highly controversial. He announced, although it was legal, that he was running for a third term. He was, at that point, defying a long precedent that had been set by the nation's first president. And then, to make matters even more interesting, his own vice president, who had turned on him on the court issue, he had to kick him off the ballot. In fact, he told them, if you nominate him as vice president, I will refuse the nomination. And ultimately, he was reelected on a promise, ultimately reelected by a pretty big margin, but he had to make a promise: I will keep this country out of war. This sets the stage going into November, December 1940. A president that had spent the last 3 years battling his own party, had seen his own agenda slowed and stifled, and then had to kick off his own vice president after getting involved in primaries against his own party. He loses a large number of seats in the House and in the Senate, has a coalition form against him to block him, and then has to make a promise: we're not going to war. All the while, understanding that what was happening in Europe would eventually reach us, and he was preparing for war. And why he made that promise was pretty fundamental. Going to war was not popular in this country. Millions of Americans, particularly those at the time you couldn't really travel abroad, had no connections to Europe. They looked at World War I as a European war, and they looked at the Second World War as just another trick to get America sucked back into a war that had to do with Europeans and not with them. Prominent voices, chief among them, Charles Lindbergh, traveled the country blasting the president as a warmonger in the strongest possible terms. There was actually a student anti-war movement. Now, not as many people went to college at that time as did in the 60s, but it was really a precursor to that very movement. Why? Because these young people in college were the ones that were going to be sent to war if there was one, and they wanted no part of it. And then, in the blink of an eye, at 7:48 a.m. on the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. They sunk 4 of our battleships. We lost almost 200 airplanes, and 2,300 Americans perished on that very day. Even to the end of the war, it remained the third bloodiest day of that very bloody conflict. America was not ready for war. They had started a draft by a one-vote margin. They were able to vote it into place. They had begun some basic rearmament, but we had lost a significant percentage of our Pacific fleet. And frankly, to this day, there are legitimate questions, not about whether the Roosevelt administration knew in advance that this was happening and allowed the attack to happen. No, those are conspiracy theories that they should have known. This was a massive intelligence failure. In fact, up to 30 minutes before that attack, the ambassador to Japan was here negotiating with the United States over an oil embargo. And America, by the way, was not a society at peace. This was a nation deeply divided, a segregated nation that discriminated against citizens of color. There were very serious labor disputes going on throughout the country. Many still wore the scars of a deep and painful economic depression. And yet, in the blink of an eye, this nation was confronted with an enemy and had no choice but to put aside all that had happened to that point. Everything, all the problems they had with the president, all the problems they had with each other. Even those Americans that had been discriminated against were willing to do that. Tremendous testament to the contribution they made to the effort to win that conflict. And in the blink of an eye, literally every aspect of American life was changed overnight. Think about it. 1 minute you are a student demanding that we stay out of war, and the next you are volunteering for service. 1 minute you're a housewife, you're a retiree. The next minute you're back at work, or at work for the first time in your life at a factory, making munitions or something else needed for the war effort. School kids, children, were put to work in farms because so many people had left farming to move and fill the industrial jobs, because the men that would have otherwise fulfilled those jobs were now wearing a uniform and dying by the hundreds every day, and then by the thousands all over the world. We rationed food. There was food rationing. You could only eat so much. A family only got so much. Gasoline was rationed. I think it was 3 gallons a week, if I'm not mistaken. Clothes was rationed. You know, the government stepped in and said, you can't build kitchen appliances, no refrigerators, no ovens, no vacuum cleaners, none of it. We need all of our industrial capacity to fight and win a war. People on the coasts, and you still see old pictures of this to this day, off Miami Beach, off New York. People had to have these, turn your lights off at night and close the shades to your window because there were German U-boats just off our East Coast. People were asked to make tremendous sacrifices. Not for 3 months, not for 6 weeks, for over 3 years and longer. And sacrifices ultimately, perhaps the greatest of all, they sent their sons and fathers off to die in the defense of this country and of our freedoms. I do not mean to diminish the challenges that are being asked of us now. There isn't 5 minutes that goes by that I don't get a call, a text, or an email from a small business who just 2 weeks ago was having its best year ever, talking about hiring new people, and now they're bankrupt. They're done. They're finished. And they may never reopen again. From a young couple I talked about earlier today in a video that I made, 2 weeks ago, recently married, planning to start a family, both had good careers. The next minute, both out of a job, not sure if the place they work in will ever exist again, not knowing where to go. 1 minute, you're the father in a family or the mother in a family who has never had a day in your life where you were not employed by someone. And the next, you're being told, go to a website or call this number, you need to go get unemployment. They don't know how to do it. They've never done it. So I do not mean to diminish the sacrifices that our people are already making. I simply mean to put it in perspective and also to give a little bit of clarity as to what will be required of us to win this war. Because in the end, our enemy is not a nation state. It doesn't wear a uniform. but it has invaded our nation in a way that's required us to do things we have not been asked to do or anything close to it since late 1941. So what are the lessons to be taken by that era in our history? By the call I got today saying, stop saying this is unprecedented. The lesson to be taken is, number one, in moments like this, government action matters. It is important that we have a functioning government that can address problems in the space in which government must act. That is what is being asked of us here today. What is being asked of us is not to pass a perfect bill or to pass legislation that will cure the virus or to pass a law that has everything we've ever wanted. What's being asked of us is, can you function as a government? Can you do the most basic things that a society needs from its elected leaders at a moment of true crisis? Can you do that? And so far, for 3 days, the answer, sadly, has been no. I hope the answer at the end of this day will be different. But the second thing it teaches us is, you cannot confront a challenge such as this with just government. That war was not just won because of political leaders or our armed forces. It was a whole of society effort. Every day, Americans were being asked to do things they had never done before in places they had never been, not just to make sacrifices from what they couldn't have, but sacrifices in what they were asked to do affirmatively. That will require the same of us now. And I want to tell you, there are people already doing that as we speak. The examples are too long to mention. But all over this country, there are people that are doing extraordinary things, stepping up, doing more than they've ever done, because they have to. They know they must. I have no doubt that if our government leaders do their job and are willing to do their part and provide people transparent, clear, truthful guidelines about what we face and what lies ahead and what is expected of them, they may not be happy and people may not be excited about it, but they will do it. I know they will do it. They are already doing it. The third lesson is the awesome power of our country when a diverse population of go-getters, the most creative people that have ever walked the earth, come together, put aside their differences to confront a threat they face in common. And again, that is not possible. You can't ask of that of a society. You can't ask people to put aside their differences, put aside the trivial, put aside the things they don't agree on, and focus on the one thing that threatens us all. You can't ask them to do that if you're not willing to do it yourself. And it appears, at least up till this moment, that we have failed to do it. I hope today is a difference in that regard. We shall see. But it takes me back to the point I made originally. What is our job in this? Well, let me say that we are asking, and I say we, those of us in government at every level, are asking of our people to do some very difficult things. We're asking high school seniors, including one that lives in my home, to be the first in I don't know how many generations that won't have a prom, won't have a senior trip, won't have a graduation. Now, I know all those things may seem trivial and pale in comparison to World War II. But for a 17-year-old, these are a rite of passage. And there are many high school seniors in this country that will not get that this year. We're going to ask small businesses, and have asked them already, you need to close your doors. You can't open, you can't work, you can't make money, you can't allow customers to come in. We've asked people not to go to work. In fact, we've told them not to leave their homes. Over half this country is on an order, don't leave your house unless you're going to the doctor, the pharmacy, the gas station, or the grocery store. We're asking nurses and doctors to confront a virus that can infect them and their families and kill them and their families, just like anybody else, to do so on double shifts, oftentimes without the gear and the equipment to protect them. We're asking truck drivers to drive all night, also vulnerable to the virus, also worried about all the other things all of us are worried about, drive all night. Because tomorrow, those shelves need to be stocked with all the things that people are buying because they're afraid it's going to run out. And how can we ask that of our society if for 3.5 days we can't even vote on a law? We can't even walk to the front of this place and lift our finger up or down and say yes or no. We can't even do that. Spending the taxpayers' money on behalf of the taxpayers in a moment of critical crisis. I don't mean to be negative because, frankly, I hope that today is a day we'll get this solved, but there are still other people that have to weigh in here. In the House, outside commentators, people still emailing and texting, can we change this, can we change that? I just don't know how we can ask people to do all these things we need to ask them to do, and in return tell them, by the way, we're going to take our sweet time to do our part, and our part's the easiest one. And you can just imagine, extrapolate what we're facing now and take it back to 1941. Imagine if back then people would have been saying, boy, this is a great chance. This is a good opportunity to get back at FDR. This is a great opportunity now. He's in war. Let's roll back the New Deal. Let's really stick it to him for what he did 6 years ago with that court thing. Or the reverse, if he would have said, boy, this is a good opportunity to use the war powers that a president has to steamroll my political opponents and put in place whatever I want and run them over. Or imagine if we were saying, we need to build a lot of ships, but I'm not going to vote to build it unless you're building it in my state. I don't want to go any deeper into that because I don't mean that to say that some of the issues that people raise around here are not legitimate issues. They are. But sometimes the legitimacy of the issue, the importance of the issue, has to be weighed on a scale against the gravity of the moment. And I would say to you, if we were dealing with permanent policy in a normal course of business or even in a moment of a cyclical economic downturn, we'd have some weeks to make some of these decisions. We've already taken too long. People got laid off today. People will be laid off tonight and tomorrow and the day after and for days to come, even if we pass this bill. Imagine if we don't. What we are facing is the toughest thing this generation's ever faced. There's no doubt about it. And perhaps with the exception of gentlemen and people like the gentleman that called me this morning, it'd be the toughest thing we ever face in our lives. World War II was worse. This virus is terrible. But it will not last as long or kill as many people as that war did. But it will kill far too many people and last far too long. But it will last longer and kill more if we don't take action now. And that requires everyone to finally wake up and realize this virus doesn't care who you voted for in the last election. It doesn't care what you write on Twitter or what snarky remarks you come up with in your commentator moment on cable news. It doesn't care about any of that stuff. It doesn't care who you plan to vote for in the next election. It will infect you. It will kill you. It will kill people you love. It will kill members of your family. It will disrupt your community and your economy. It doesn't care about any of this other stuff. And it really is important for us to realize, not just for this bill, but moving forward, that there's no such thing as an outcome here that's good for half of us and bad for the other half. There is no possible political victory here. None. There is no outcome here in which half of us are going to be able to go back and say, boy, we really looked good and we made those guys look really bad and people are going to reward us for it. They're not. I promise you that when someone has lost their job and doesn't know where they're going to go and are stuck in their home and their lives have been turned upside down and a member of their family is in intensive care and they wind up at a hospital that's been overwhelmed and they can't care for them, they are not going to be, the last thing on their mind is going to be partisan politics or pre-existing differences. If you don't believe it, we're about to find that out, unfortunately. There is no outcome here in which half of us is happy and the other half are upset. It's a cliche. We use it all the time. I can't think of a better example than this one. We are truly all in this together. The carnage, the damage that this will do to our country is extraordinary. It will know no geographic bounds, no political affiliation, no demographic differences. This is a virus that can infect the heir to the crown in Britain just as easily as a 92-year-old retiree in a Florida nursing home. And so I hope that the gravity of the moment finally sinks in and that we take the necessary actions quickly. And if there's something in this bill you just really don't like, I don't mean to diminish it. If we can fix it, we should. But at this point, I'm going to tell you that there is nothing wrong in this bill. There's nothing in this bill that will damage our country more than our inability to act. No matter how bad some provision in this bill you think may be, and I say this to both sides, there is nothing in this bill that will damage us more than doing nothing will. By far, the most damaging thing that can happen is not any provision of this legislation. It is our inability to act and to send a message to the American people that their leaders can't function, that their government doesn't work, not just on a day-to-day basis, but in a moment of crisis. And so I hope that whatever differences may still exist at this moment, and I'm trying to be fair because I know a lot of people have finally seen the full text of it just in the last few hours, and if you've caught something that can be fixed, it should be fixed. But I plead, I don't know what other word to use, that we don't leave here tonight without having passed this bill. Because I honestly don't know how this nation and our people can afford one more day of this. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.